The Essence of Nihilism by Emanuele Severino. Introduction. The structure of Western history and the supersession of the alienated critique of alienation. The structure of Western civilization envelops every element of our history and is therefore ever present. Yet to grasp its authentic meaning, one must descend into a substratum essentially deeper than that explored by Hegel, Marxism, psychoanalysis, the hermeneutical current of Nietzsche-Heidegger, or structuralism. This substratum can be reached only if one does not set out in the company of any of the various historical reconstructions formulated by Western culture. Indeed, only if one does not set out at all. Rather, it can be reached only if the locus of necessity, i.e. the original structure of necessity, always open outside the structure of the West, permits language to testify to it, and to testify to its being abysmally alien to the structure of Western history. The structure of the West continues to be the essential unconscious of our civilization, yet that other structure, the locus of necessity, is the unconscious of this unconscious, the substratum of the substratum, that which envelops the enveloping. It is to this ultimate substratum that the present work is addressed. The structure of the West, the intermediate substratum, is the will that things be time. The original structure of necessity, i.e. the ultimate substratum, shows that the will that things be time, and therefore history, becoming, implies with necessity the will that things be nothing, or that the not-nothing be nothing. This will is nihilism. Nihilism, in its authentic essence, is the structure of the West. But the authentic essence of nihilism can manifest itself in language only if language succeeds in testifying to that ultimate and unexplored substratum in which the structure of necessity always already opens. Time is not the novelty introduced by Christian thought or by modern culture, but is what was first thought, and thought decisively, by the Greeks, and which, as technology, today rules the earth unchallenged. It is all the more unchallenged the more it remains unexplored in its authentic meaning, and it is all the more unexplored the more one thinks one grasps, as is the case with Heidegger, the meaning of the identity of being and time in Greek thought. The inhabitants of time are the forms of culture, the social institutions, the individuals, the masses, and the peoples that have progressively been subjected to this dominant structure, Europe first of all. 1. The meaning and the destiny of Europe. What is Europe? The solution of this problem is by no means an abstract cultural exercise, for there are today substantial forces working to complete the process of European unification, forces whose aim is to transform the reality of Europe. But to transform an object, even the simplest one, in a certain way, one must first know what the object is. Even the communist revolution is based upon knowledge of what that revolution intends to transform, i.e. on the analysis of capitalist society. The revolution's success depends upon the soundness of this analysis. Similarly, the success of any political action that intends to consider Europe as an object to be transformed inevitably depends upon the validity of its knowledge of European reality. Yet difficulties arise as soon as the problem is formulated. Indeed, they concern the formulation of the problem itself. In the first place, which branch of knowledge shall deal with the problem of the meaning of Europe? Within what type of knowledge is its solution to be found? Europe is a problem for the historical, social, and natural sciences, for ethnology and anthropology, for political geography and economy, and for the philosophy of history. Each of these disciplines claims to have established what Europe is, and the result that stands before us is not Europe, but many Europes as there are scientific specializations that study the object Europe. The unification of scientific knowledge today is considered a necessity, and yet we are a very long way from its realization. In fact, modern sciences have arisen precisely insofar as they have methodically restricted research to particular and distinct fields of study. Precisely, that is, insofar as they have hindered, in principle, the gaze that seeks to grasp that unity which gathers the particular fields together. Today, scientific activity entails the delimitation of a particular field of objects by means of a strictly formulated method. Everything that manifests itself independently of scientific method is held to be either non-existent or valueless. The successes of modern science are due to its specialization, but in these conditions the unification of scientific knowledge can only be the juxtaposition of many separate worlds, a juxtaposition giving rise to a fortuitous unity, inevitably of that very non-specialistic and ingenuous stamp which science wishes to avoid. Consequently, either one lets each of the individual sciences carry on in its own way, but then their unity as the unification of various specializations is a fortuitous and arbitrary juxtaposition, or else one resolves to establish a true unity, which does not simply set disciplines side by side while they continue to be practiced separately. This, however, would call for a transformation of the method and meaning of science, and who today can embark upon such an undertaking? And so, the unification of scientific knowledge remains, in fact, a dream. Europe remains hidden, and we are left to deal with the many Europes of scientific specializations. The state of the modern sciences inevitably affects political action. In addition to the aspects of European reality that come to light within the various scientific specializations, the political forces that are now working towards the unity of Europe do admittedly intend to consider historical and spiritual traditions as well, and in particular the ethical, religious, and aesthetic traditions of the European peoples. These traditions, however, are no longer presented to the contemporary statesman in their peculiar, non-scientific aspect. Rather, they too appear under the guise of what has become an object of the methodology of the socio-historical sciences. The forces working for the political unification of Europe are faced with many Europes, which they attempt to organize politically. They attempt to assign a unitary goal to an object, Europe, which is unitary in name only. This object, in effect, comprises many objects, each of which goes its own way and for which, therefore, no common goal can be set. Just as the unification of scientific knowledge is a juxtaposition of worlds, so the political unification of Europe and political action in general must also be a juxtaposition of goals. Even in the case of individual nations, one cannot fail to notice the fortuitous and arbitrary character of political action, which is incapable of giving a single direction to the separate and contrasting needs of national life. What we have here is not simply a subjective incapacity of the political class, or at least this incapacity is not the decisive factor, but rather a structural defect due to the fact that what one wishes to organize and unify simply does not lend itself to organization and unification. In this situation, the many Europes inevitably clash, with the result that the stronger Europe prevails, namely, economic Europe, or what Europe is from the standpoint of political economy. The conviction thus takes hold that the most valid reason for bringing about the political unification of Europe is provided by the capitalistic organization of European industrial production, which to compete with international big business must be freed from the fetters of the traditional organization of the European states themselves. For these fetters impede the infinite increase of production and consequent unlimited expansion of the market that the logic of capitalism demands. The juxtaposition of political goals produces a unilaterality of political action, in which the weaker goals become mere satellites of the economic goal, which prevails. This situation gives rise to that type of political eclecticism, so widespread in the Western world, which resolves to uphold the so-called values of European civilization, but only as peripheral to the nucleus of the economy. But does Europe crumble into an infinity of Europes simply because modern science is incapable of grasping the unity of this multiplicity, or rather because the selfsame object we call Europe is divided within itself into a multiplicity of separate and contrasting parts? There can be little doubt that the spectacle of struggles, contradictions, conflicts, and subtle and radical distinctions that even a summary glance at the history of European civilization reveals is not to be found in any other civilization. The intensity of the economic, political, religious, and ideological conflicts that have shaped European civilization is indeed unique. If Europe itself is essentially struggle and opposition, to what possible organic unity can political action assign a common goal? And yet, in the conflict between the forces into which the whole that we call Europe has been broken up, some forces do gain the upper hand. The supreme force that today rules unchallenged over all the others is technoscientific action, organized according to a politico-economic plan. The United States and the Soviet Union control the decisive sources of worldwide technological force, but technology, as the application of modern science to industry and thus as the factor that determines every aspect of the existence of entire masses of humanity, is essentially a European phenomenon. Technological civilization was born in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. Technoscientific force, while today dominating all other forces, also constitutes the deepest break in the continuity of European history, deeper than that produced by any ideological conflict, since it is itself the decisive factor in the crisis of every ideology. Today, the universal crisis of traditional civilization, both inside and outside Europe, is not simply accompanied, but is produced by the project that underlines technoscientific force. This force not only dominates every other force on Earth, but is based upon the project of unlimited dominion over all things, i.e., upon the project of the controlled and unlimited production and destruction of the universe. For this project, nothing in principle exists that cannot be dominated, i.e., produced and destroyed. And indeed, all limits to human action, once laid down as absolute laws, God's law, natural law, moral law, are now falling before the onslaught of technology's productive destructive capabilities. Technology surmounts all limits as it progressively invents a new world that is freeing itself from the old. No longer limited to the production of consumer goods and the hold on human labor, it is now undertaken to produce man himself, his life, feelings, thought processes, and his idea of ultimate happiness. Technology, in setting out to liberate man from pain and death, undertakes to effectively produce that which traditional culture was unable to render credible, namely God, understood as the sure possession of happiness. The meaning of reality is no longer a mere object of contemplation, but is something produced by scientific action, itself far more effective than any ideological revolution. Within the horizon of technoscientific action, a thing is nothing other than an absolute availability to be produced and destroyed. A thing not available in this way is unreal. At the outset of the modern era, the project of an unlimited dominion over all things was only expressly formulated by a few individuals: Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, and even they were not free from all reservations due to the persistence of traditional culture. But with the advent of the machine age, capitalism presented this project as the ultimate horizon, within which the labor of the masses becomes meaningful, and of which ever greater masses of workers are gaining consciousness. The world as it is within the technological project, the world as a place where all things can be dominated, produced, and destroyed, is the fundamental spectacle set before the working masses. The masses know that they do not rule the world, but they also know that by means of their labor all things are about to be opened up to unlimited production and destruction. The technological meaning of the thing is rapidly becoming the meaning the thing assumes for the European masses. The capitalistic organization of industrial production measures every other world of European man against the world of technology, and technology's ever greater productive, destructive capabilities give rise to the crisis of those traditional worlds, and so to the triumph of the meaning that reality assumes within the world of technology. The supreme spectacle, which in European man from the 19th century onward has overshadowed every other spectacle, this technological meaning of being, is in no way questioned by communism. Marxism and neo-Marxism do not reject industry and technology, but only their capitalistic organization. The communist revolution simply replaces the capitalistic with a socialistic organization of technology, while both forms of organization share that meaning which reality, which the thing, assumes within technology itself. And today it is within this meaning, within the project of the production and destruction of all things, that any attempt to render technological civilization less inhuman must be made. Socialist humanism and ecology do not advocate the abolition of this project. They simply affirm that, if rendered more rational, it would become more efficient and more in keeping with the essential values of the day. And while Christianity and its churches do not believe, and certainly do not hope, that technology will be capable of destroying the kingdom of God, they cannot fail to realize that Christian love between peoples is impossible today outside of the techno-scientific elaboration of existence. Ideological conflict is heightened when there is great technological disparity between opposing forces, as between international guerrilla movements and the established order. But it is milder in cases where the technological potential of the antagonists tends to be balanced. Thus, we are approaching a historical situation in which the capitalistic and socialistic character of the organization of technology will be superseded by the purely technological character of this organization. And if one should object that the tools of technology ultimately draw their force from the moral force of the men who use them, then it must be pointed out that technology today has undertaken to reshape the individual's mental structure in order to give it just those psychological qualities, or moral forces, which are required for these tools to function efficiently. Where do these considerations lead us? We remarked at the outset that scientific specialization makes it impossible to speak of Europe as a simple object. Furthermore, European history appears in itself as a struggle between opposing forces, where the most radical break with the past is constituted by that destruction of traditional European civilization, which technological civilization is now bringing to completion. But in this self-same act, technological civilization also produces the profoundest unification of Europe's and the world's present, for a single meaning of the world has become worldwide, that meaning which the world assumes within the project of an unlimited domination of all things. The world is the scene of this domination. At the root of scientific specialization lies that very orientation towards domination that has in specialization itself the indispensable condition for its own realization. Dominating means marking out a particular dimension and positing it as independent of the whole. Undertaking to dominate all things demands a vision of the whole as broken up into a multiplicity of isolated worlds. To dominate a unitary vision of the world has to be abandoned. The world lets itself be dominated precisely insofar as it is broken up into many infinite worlds controlled by individual scientific specializations, and yet this dealing with many worlds is an inevitable consequence of the essentially unitary meaning the world assumes within the attitude and civilization of science and technology. This unitary meaning, which constitutes the essence of present-day Europe, an essence that now advances far beyond the geographic borders of Europe and dominates the world, is nothing else than the availability of everything to unlimited production and destruction. Europe today is unified by technological domination. As the matrix of technological civilization, it is the destruction of its own past. And yet, this past is the secret of the present. We have to prepare ourselves to understand that this technological meaning of the world is by no means a deviation from the spirit of traditional European culture. On the contrary, its origin lies in the remotest past of this very tradition, and the historical course of this meaning is its progressive branching out into the great forms of traditional European civilization. This course is, in fact, the unitary meaning of European history. Technological civilization brings the great forms of European tradition to their setting not because the meaning of the world that dominates them differs from the meaning that dominates technological civilization, but rather because such forms are in contradiction with their own essence. For indeed, this essence is nothing but the meaning of the world that rules unchallenged in technological civilization, where its form has now become adequate to its essence. The essence of traditional European civilization and culture finds in technological civilization its most complete and rigorous realization. The old European world can be itself only in the new European world that is destroying it. How can this be so? It should be observed first that the meaning of the world of which we are speaking has nothing to do with a Weltanschauung, an intuition of the world. A Weltanschauung is an ideology, a specific mode of understanding the origin, value, destination, and purpose of human life in the world. Indeed, there has been a succession of differing and contrasting Weltanschauungen in the course of European history. But when we speak here of the meaning of the world that dominates the entire history of Europe, we are referring to the deep substratum that persists identically beneath such Weltanschauungen and guides this variation. This substratum is essentially deeper than any structure upon which structuralism may be based, but at the same time it distinguishes European history and is not to be found elsewhere. For Marxism, European history remains a mystery as long as one insists upon understanding it as a development of ideologies. All ideologies, economics, law, philosophy, art, politics, mirror on the theoretical plane the mode in which man, through his labor, produces. Ideologies are functions of production, whose constitution and variation derive from economic conditions. The earth, says Marx, is the common object of human labor. It is transformed according to man's purposes. In fact, Marx agrees that labor is purposive activity, zweckmäßige Tätigkeit. But this means that man can set to work only insofar as he sees the difference between the earth, still untouched by his labor, and the ideal project he intends to realize. To act purposively means to see the difference between things as they are and as one wishes them to be, and so it means that labor, all labor, is based upon the manifestation, the presence, the appearing of things. If for Marxism the ground of every ideology lies in the mode of human labor, It is also essential to note that the ground of all labor entails the manifestation of things, and hence the manifestation of the meaning that the thing has for man. When the lumberjack carries out his work, the fir tree he is cutting down stands before him not simply as a fir tree, but as the thing, and the way in which he wields his axe is not determined simply by the meaning that the fir tree has for him, but fundamentally by the meaning that the thing has for him. This meaning envelops and guides the lumberjack's whole life and work, for everything with which he deals is, indeed, a thing. For Marx, as for a European lumberjack of, say, the 19th century, the meaning of the word thing is beyond dispute, as moreover it is for every Western philosopher who nonetheless explicitly undertakes to grasp the meaning of the thing. And yet this meaning is not constant throughout man's history. Rather, it is itself historical, and its varying constitutes the ultimate ground of the variation of historical epochs. So in saying that a single meaning of the world pervades Europe and renders it an organic whole, we mean that a single mode of understanding what the thing is, a single meaning of the thing, guides, establishes, and unifies the immense variety of events and works of European history. At a certain moment in man's history, a meaning of the thing came to light in Europe that was progressively to impose itself on all other meanings, and that today dominates unchallenged every aspect of Western civilization. What exactly are we referring to? In the technoscientific project of a controlled and unlimited production, destruction of all things, the thing is understood as absolute availability to be produced and destroyed. A thing is that which may be produced and destroyed without limit. And we all know what it means to produce and to destroy a thing. To produce it means to bring it into being, to make it issue forth from nothingness. To destroy it means to take its being away, to make it return to nothingness. Physics tells us that after the atom bomb destroyed Hiroshima, the total amount of energy in the universe remained the same. But Hiroshima was not simply a quantity of energy. The quantity existed as a specific unity of shapes, colors, sounds, states of mind, and it is of this unity that we say that it has become nothing. If it had not become nothing, or if no aspect of Hiroshima had become a nothing, we would not say that Hiroshima has been destroyed. But do we really believe that this discourse on being and nothing has no surprise in store? Do we believe that it is perfectly natural? Or did it rather begin at a specific moment in human history, at the moment when the history of European civilization began? It must be understood that the thing is an absolute availability to production and destruction by virtue of the fact that it is available to being and to nothingness, i.e. to the absolutely opposed. Technology can undertake to produce and destroy things without limit only insofar as the thing is first thought as that which issues from and returns to nothingness, i.e. as that which issues from the extreme, unlimited remoteness of nothingness and returns there. Here, the thing is not simply available to new forms, states, and encounters. It is available to the two ways that grow so distant from one another that they reach the infinite distance that is the distance from being to nothingness. As available to both these ways, the thing is an infinite oscillation that bridges the infinite distance separating being from nothingness. For the first time in the history of man, several centuries before Christ, Greek philosophy brought to light the meaning of this absolute availability of the thing, in the moment, that is, when it understood the thing as that which oscillates between being and nothing. The thing as such is, but what was not, did not exist, will not be, and might not have been. What is, the Greeks called toon, being, ente. For the Greeks, God is immutable and eternal, i.e., neither issues from nor returns to nothingness, not insofar as he is a being, but insofar as he is a certain being, a privileged being, enjoying a nature not possessed by other beings. Qua being, considered purely and simply as being, even God would be an oscillation between being and nothingness. Being as being is this oscillation. The testimony to the meaning of being and of nothing, and thus the meaning of the thing for Greek thought, has no precedent in the history of man. Greek philosophy thought for the first time the infinite distance that opposes being to nothingness, and the infinite agility that allows being to bridge it, thus becoming nothing, and that allows nothing to bridge it, thus becoming being. From this moment onward, the totality of things appears as the totality of beings, and the Greek meaning of being sets out on the course that will lead it to progressively envelop, dominate, and unify all the great forms of European culture. Little by little, in each of these forms, the things with which man deals manifest themselves as beings. If the lumberjack cuts down his fir tree, if the religious man works for the salvation of his soul, if technology constructs an artificial satellite or paradise on Earth, if the politician works for the construction of European unity, then the fir tree, the soul's salvation, artificial satellites, heaven on earth, and the political unity of Europe are manifest first of all as beings, and their being beings establishes the meaning, the tone, the intensity, the being so, and not otherwise, of all the human activities that refer to them. Technological civilization and scientific specialization are essentially grounded in Greek metaphysics as openness of the meaning of being. Only if being as such is that which is available to being and to nothingness can one then devise the project of unlimited production and destruction of all things. In the beginning, the task of producing and destroying things was entrusted fundamentally to a divine art, or techne. Plato's term is theia techne. Similarly, modern Europe realized that if God existed, the creative activity of man would be impossible. God would have already done everything. Man, accordingly, supplants the old God, but maintains his fundamental trait, that of being the force which dominates the creation and destruction of things. Science and modern technology have heightened this force to unprecedented intensity. Yet theology is but the earliest form of technology, and technology but the latest form of theology. The thing, in its availability to being and to nothingness, is prey to divine and human forces that tear it away from being and from nothingness. The original expression of the will to power lies in the very way that Greek metaphysics opened up the meaning of the thing. The will to power means originally the will that things be being. Be, that is, an issuing from and returning to nothingness. And any rejection of the will to power by modern philosophy, by Marx, Heidegger, or others, is merely apparent, since the entire history of philosophic thought moves wholly within the Greek meaning of the thing. The forms of domination and exploitation of man and of nature, which have characterized European history, have been possible only insofar as Greek metaphysics opened up the original horizon of the will to power. And indeed, the practical spirit of modern European man is grounded upon that contemplative spirit which finds in metaphysics its most rigorously consistent realization. At an early date, the metaphysical meaning of the thing passed beyond the boundaries of philosophic thought. While the historical sciences are well aware of the ubiquity of the categories of Greek thought even in the most disparate regions of European civilization, they fail to recognize the essential dominance established with the diffusion of these categories. The vehicle of this diffusion is language, and the education of whole generations of Europeans has been based upon a grammar of Greek and Latin that draws directly upon Greek logic and its meaning of the thing. This meaning was then transmitted to the grammatical elaborations that govern the formation of national European languages, as they shed their initially popular character and became an expression of cultural values. The various sectors of the modern sciences constitute the linguistic field where the European national languages most clearly show their common Greek root. After penetrating the non-philosophic forms of Greek culture, the Greek meaning of the thing enveloped Roman civilization, the Christian message, the history of Western philosophy, Justinian's codification of Roman law, and later the entire history of European law, the fundamental categories of the European economic and political orders, the new science of nature and its application to industry, the world of European poetry, architecture, and music, operations upon mathematical entities, and finally the common way of thinking and the public opinion of the European peoples, and now, through technology's worldwide dominance, of all the peoples on earth. The history of Europe is the progressive appropriation of things, i.e. the progressive exploitation of their absolute availability, their infinite oscillation between being and nothingness. The technological project of domination puts aside all reservations regarding this availability. It abolishes all limits to domination, and in so doing celebrates the triumph of metaphysics. Modern science, in transforming reality, thinks it has destroyed sterile metaphysical contemplation. The European bourgeoisie saw in natural science the true form of knowledge, useful for production and exchange, and on the basis of the democratic character of intersubjective scientific knowledge rejected metaphysics as useless and aristocratic. Christianity made itself master of the European masses, denying metaphysics' claim to be the supreme form of human knowledge. All contemporary philosophy is a rejection of metaphysics. Indeed, the failure of metaphysics is an expression of the success of European science, economics, politics, and religion, i.e., of the dominant forces of modern Europe. And yet, the essence of these forces is the very meaning of being that makes possible the scientific domination of nature, industrial production, and commercial exchange, and the Christian conception of a divine creation of the world. It is that meaning of being which the Greeks opened up once and for all. And thus the destruction of metaphysics is at the same time its triumph, the triumph, that is, of the original form of the will to power. If the European vocation for technological domination of the universe goes back to Greek metaphysics, and if this is what the unitary meaning of Europe essentially is, then the goal that must be assigned to Europe when undertaking its political unification has to consist in freeing this vocation from any form of traditional civilization that still obstructs, hinders, and delays the dominance of the technological essence of things. European history itself is the progressive liberation of this essence from all the forms of traditional European culture, i.e., the political, ethical, religious, and philosophical ideologies that, while themselves forms of this essence, are nonetheless in contradiction with it, since they attempt to limit the absolute and infinite dominability of things. All contemporary criticism raised on the basis of Western culture against technological civilization nonetheless moves within that essential horizon, the Greek meaning of the thing, whose most rigorous and coherent testimony and realization is technological civilization itself. This fact has been overlooked by those who wish to pit the United States and the Soviet Union against a Europe that, while no means economically underdeveloped, is above all the bearer of values allegedly on a level different from and superior to the will to power as it is now expressed in the technological domination of all things. The spiritual values of traditional European civilization are in fact inadequate forms of the will to power, from which technological civilization, as the adequate form of the will to power, is radically freeing itself. If the unitary meaning of European civilization is the will to power, as openness of the technological meaning of the thing, then the political effort to make Europe the scene of an extreme intensification of technological development is definitely on the right track. Although we may seem to be nearing the end of our discourse, in fact we have not yet touched upon the decisive aspect of the problem. We have glimpsed how it is possible to trace the events of European history back to their unitary meaning, to a structure that, while dominating the entire history of the West, consistently eludes our historical consciousness. But what would occur if this meaning, i.e., the European meaning of the thing, the essence of our civilization, and thus that of which we are most deeply convinced, were to appear as the deepest alienation of man, essentially deeper than any original sin, than any economic or psychological alienation, than any error? What would occur if the affirmation of the essential alienation of European civilization were to appear not simply as the opinion of one of us, or of a prophet, not as a faith or a hypothesis, but as the truth, that no time, no omnipotent God, and no other power on earth can destroy or deny? To know what man's true alienation is it not in fact necessary to know what truth is? And will true alienation not be, then, the alienation of truth? For European civilization, the thing is that which issues from and returns to nothingness. Being and nothing establish the meaning of the birth and death, the production and destruction of things. For this civilization, the supreme evidence is that there is a time, the past, when things became nothing, and a time, the future, when things will be nothing once more. Being is in time, by which it is devoured. The essential alienation of the West stands right before our eyes, but presents itself as supreme and indisputable evidence. If essential alienation irretrievably eludes our consciousness, this is not because it is hidden in some remote and unexplored region, but rather because it has long stood before us as so utterly indisputable that no one even deigns to pay it any heed. We say things past and things future are nothing. What could be more indisputable? But in this indisputable conviction, we by no means intend to affirm that nothing is nothing. That is, it is not of nothing that we intend to say that it is a nothing, but rather of things past or things future, i.e., of that whose meaning is not identical with the meaning nothing. But that whose meaning is not identical with the meaning nothing is not a nothing. We say of the city Hiroshima that it became nothing, but Hiroshima does not mean nothing, and thus is not a nothing. Hiroshima, of which we say that now it is a nothing, is not a nothing. And so we think that that which is not a nothing is a nothing. The past and the future are the time when things, i.e. that which is not a nothing, are nothing. If they were to tell us that the past and the future are the time when the circle is squared, we would be quick to rejoin that there can be no such time, that any such identification of circle and square would be absurd. But this sense of the absurd, which makes us reject a time when the circle is squared, does not prevent us from thinking of a time when the thing, i.e. that which is not a nothing, is nothing. Nor does it prevent us from living and acting according to this thought. We think and we live things as if they were nothing. For European civilization, things are nothing. The meaning of the thing, which guides Western history, is the nothingness of things. Nihilism is the essence of European civilization, since the fundamental meaning of nihilism is the annihilation of things, i.e. the belief that being is a nothing. Nihilism is the action guided and shaped by this conviction. Greek metaphysics is the original and decisive expression of nihilism. The will that the thing be being is the will that the thing be nothing, and it is within nihilism that the most irremediable conflicts of Western civilization have developed: Christianity and anti-Christianity, theism and atheism, lordship and bondage, spiritualism and materialism, philosophic realism and philosophic idealism, metaphysics and anti-metaphysics, contemplatism and pragmatism, philosophy and anti-philosophy, faith and reason, bourgeois economics and socialistic economics, democracy and absolutism, traditionalism and the global challenge to society. All these inexorable antagonists clash within a substantial agreement. They express antithetically the same dominant thought. They share the decisive and fundamental trait that guides the West. Nihilism is the ethos, the dwelling place of the West. It is the West's structure. The history of the West is a history of nihilism in an abysmally different sense from that denounced by Nietzsche and Heidegger. The genuine meaning of European nihilism, in which even the masses, public opinion, and the most ordinary people are now living, is something essentially different from and infinitely more radical than the human situation as depicted by existentialism. For existentialism, human life issues from and returns to nothingness and is not guaranteed by a transcendent God. But existentialism does not claim that when man lives, his life is nothing. For existentialism, existing means having to do with nothingness, but this having to do with nothingness is not itself a nothing. Existence is a flash in the night of nothingness. But this flash is not a nothing. Nihilism, by contrast, as the authentic and deeply hidden essence of European civilization, as the essence that guides not only the entire development of Western philosophy, but even the everyday behavior of the man in the street and the superficial conviction of public opinion, is something essentially more radical than existentialism, or than the world as it appears in the consciousness of an existentialist philosopher. The nihilism of European civilization lies in a substratum essentially deeper and more unexplored than the terrain that European philosophical consciousness is able to chart. Europe may come to express its own essence as a flash in the night of nothingness, but Europe's underlying thought, consistently unexpressed in European consciousness, is that the flash of existence is itself the night of nothingness, is that things as such are nothing. The essential alienation of European civilization can be indicated then in a few words, but the comprehension of these words is decisive for Europe's and the world's destiny. The words are these: thinking that things are not when they were not yet born, or not yet produced, or when they perish, or are destroyed, means thinking that things, i.e. that which is not a nothing, are nothing. This is the thought that originated with Greek metaphysics, and that guides and unifies the entire history of the West. Indeed, this thought is the basis of every historical interpretation, from Hegel to Nietzsche, from Weber and Husserl to Heidegger and the Frankfurt School, that discerns in Greek thought the secret of European civilization. Nihilism, in its authentic and unexplored meaning, envelops even those philosophies that proclaim the nihilistic character of European history, and the very notion of history and historical becoming is a reflection of nihilism. For Nietzsche and Heidegger too, nihilism is the essence of Europe, but even they fail to recognize the authentic meaning of nihilism, and indeed their very philosophies represent one of the most typical forms of what nihilism really is. To this day, philosophic thought has failed to recognize the genuine meaning of European nihilism, and thus it is incapable of saying what Europe is. Even when contemporary philosophy is critical of technology, it is still dominated by that essence whose most radical realization is technology itself. For European technology is nihilism, not insofar as technology is used badly, but insofar as it is technology. The ideologies that cause it to be used badly or well share with the so-called neutral nature of technology the decisive trait of nihilism, the belief that things, men, the sky, stars, planets, history, are nothing. But European civilization can appear as the locus of essential alienation only insofar as the truth of things appears. In truth, things are not separated from being to be entrusted to nothing. Rather, all things share the nature of the incorruptible gods. Parmenides said, "You shall not sunder being from its connection with being." Fragment 4. In the truth of being, first testified to by Parmenides, this is to say that everything is eternal, and that history is the process of the rising and setting of the whole, which includes the very night of nihilism. Contrary to what we have firmly believed for more than 2,000 years, the gods of the West are jealous. They attempt to keep the nature of the incorruptible for themselves, while leaving birth and death, the issuing from and returning to nothingness, to things. Technological civilization is the offspring of this jealousy of the gods. The gods deceived Prometheus when they let him steal divine fire. What they left him was the technological capacity to produce and destroy that presupposes the birth and death of things, while they themselves had long attempted to oppose that birth and death with their own eternity. European civilization was later to destroy the gods, but it has continued to live as the offspring of their jealousy. The setting of the West's gods still belongs to the inner history of nihilism, but the setting of their jealousy is the supersession of nihilism and the testimony to the eternity of everything. The truth of being states that everything is eternal. In undertaking to dominate the creation and annihilation of things, the West attempts the impossible. It attempts to make being nothing. But the impossible does not become possible simply because one attempts it. Alienation means attempting the impossible, and the history of the West is the concrete aspect of this attempt. Attempting the impossible, the West is inevitably destined to experience the most radical anxiety. In fact, technological civilization is grounded on the modern science of nature, which originated as a rejection of Greek episteme. Episteme is the thought that intends to constitute itself as science, in the sense of incontrovertible and necessary truth, and that as metaphysical theoretical knowledge guides the entire course of pre-Renaissance civilization. The rejection of episteme later entered the domain of philosophic knowledge, with the result that philosophy today sees itself as hypothetical, provisional, open to revision. This means that the technological project to dominate all things no longer finds any theoretical obstacle in its path. Truth today means power, and technology is the supreme power. But precisely because technology is the negation of any definitive truth, and to dominate the transformation of things it must be the negation, the destiny of the West is radical anxiety. Indeed, any happiness, any paradise that may be constructed by technoscientific praxis will be insecure. Technological civilization can produce all things and eliminate the regret for any happiness that religion once gave, yet it cannot produce the incontrovertible and definitive security of its own dominion. Any logic that undertakes to ground this security is inevitably insecure, precisely because it is hypothetical. If the whole is to be dominated, it can have no definitive truth. Yet technological civilization wishes its domination of the whole to be definitive truth. But no hypothetical logic can ground the definitive truth of its dominion. The ultimate power destined to be realized by the West is essentially insecure. It is threatened by the possibility of utter ruin, because there does not, and in technological civilization cannot, exist an incontrovertible and definitive truth that can ground the impossibility of losing the happiness attained. But the fact that radical anxiety is the destiny of the West cannot be avoided by reinstating episteme and its world, since modern science and technological civilization are the inevitable consequence of the way in which Greek episteme, the original locus of nihilism, first thought the meaning of being. The forces that are working today for the political unification of Europe assign Europe a goal. But to assign Europe a goal, one needs to know what Europe is. Nihilism is the essence of Europe, yet the supersession of nihilism is the hidden goal that guides this alienated essence. Here lies the salvation of Europe and today of the world. If nihilism is to set, its essential meaning must first of all come out of the darkness that envelops it. But nihilism is no longer a mere mode of thought. It has become the concrete life of peoples, their institutions, and their values. If nihilism is to set, it is not sufficient that thought, denouncing the essential alienation of Western civilization, testify to the truth of being, even if this testimony is indeed the first fundamental step toward the salvation of the West. If nihilism is to set, the works of nihilism must set. This setting is a revolution which, recognizing the nihilistic character of all the revolutions in Western history, opens up the dimension of a new and essentially different meaning of action, a dimension in which a history of peoples can begin that is not a history of nihilism. Every attempt to resolve the problems of contemporary civilization treats the symptoms of a mortal sickness, the essence of which is ignored, and every attempt is therefore destined to fail, if failure means remaining within the most abysmal alienation of the essence of man. On a sinking ship, one may no doubt be concerned that provisions be evenly distributed, that the crew does not riot, and that life on board be bearable for all. But the essential concern is to find the leak. If the leak is not found, it cannot be repaired, and the shipwreck that follows not only renders the solution of the problems of life on board altogether superfluous, but shows how no solutions have been provided at all, or that the solutions provided were merely illusory. And today, this illusion has convinced us all. We are willing to consider only particular and immediate problems that can be faced one at a time, problems whose solutions are already in sight. As regards the unification of Europe, the problems of the day concern the augmentation of production and technological development, underdeveloped areas, the relation of parliamentary democracy with communism and fascism, extra-European relations. And everything we have said here in no way helps to resolve them. Yet this pragmatic attitude that exclusively concerned with the problems of life on board will not even hear of a leak in the hull is itself, like the specialization of scientific knowledge, an inevitable consequence of what the Greeks understood by the word being. If things issue from nothingness and are therefore altogether unpredictable, it is impossible to diagnose a sickness and a fundamental alienation of existence. Rather, one is obliged to take things as they come, facing the problems they bring with specific techniques. The pragmatic attitude is an inevitable consequence of metaphysical speculation, i.e. of the belief that things are nothing. And Europe will have to assume this attitude to an even greater degree if it is to remain faithful to its own metaphysical essence. But if truth brings the conviction of the nothingness of things to their setting, then the solutions, past and projected, to the problems of European civilization will be revealed for what they are: illusions. And yet, it is through European civilization that man's salvation must pass, for Europe is the locus of the mortal sickness of man. The great Oriental civilizations developed outside of European nihilism, not because the Orient is the dominion of truth, but because it did not reach the fork, where the path of night, nuktos keluthos, as Parmenides called it, traveled by European civilization, branches off from the path of day, ematos keluthos, where history grows in the light of truth and which has not yet been traveled by men. The Orient was not saved. It had not yet reached the place where salvation or perdition is decided. The Orient is not health. It is the state that precedes sickness. Europe has sunk into the deepest alienation precisely because Europe alone, in the history of man, attempted to testify to the truth of being. Europe is blind because Europe alone attempted to look at the sun. Man must pass through this blindness. He must travel to the end of the path of night, for truth at last to illuminate his gaze. We do not know if this be man's portion, but if traveling the path of day is in fact part of his destiny, then this road is open to him only because Europe, turning toward the truth of being, was blinded by this truth and took up the burden of essential alienation. Europe alone thought the meaning of the thing in relation to the meaning of being and nothing, but Europe did not lose its way because it established this relation, but rather because it separated things from being, entrusting them to nothing, thus initiating a development that has led to the very refusal so widespread in contemporary philosophical culture, to recognize as meaningful the words being and nothing. The setting of nihilism is the setting of the European meaning of the thing, but it is the repetition of the attempt, which is what Europe essentially is, to testify to the meaning of being. Europe must set for the voice that called it to be heard. Will Europe be able to hearken to this voice?